at this next segment in our Did Paul Really Mean That? Encountering the St. Paul the Difficult. Did you have any questions maybe from last week you didn't get a chance to address? Because what we're going to talk about tonight is Paul and his opponents, which is really, in the end, going to be about, in some respects, Paul behaving badly. Okay? I do want to set the context for why people would have opposed him. We'll see how he responded to those opponents, and then we're going to evaluate his response. And in some cases, we're going to see Paul at his, as Nietzsche once said, at his allzu menschlich, at his all too humanness. Okay? So, talk about opposition to Paul. Now, it's kind of, see if I can get the focus on this a little sharper. In some respects, we tend to think of, Paul, because he's a quarter of the New Testament and all of that, as someone you would never want to oppose, except that people did. Okay? It is, in fact, beyond dispute, from an historical perspective, that Paul encountered a great deal of opposition during the course of his ministry. Opposition which is chronicled in the letters, and opposition that's also chronicled in the Acts of the Apostles. Now, again, from a methodological point of view, I'm excluding the evidence from the Acts of the Apostles because I simply want to examine what evidence we have in the letters themselves, okay? Given the fact that Acts was written some 25 or 30 years after his death. Some of the opposition, and I'm going to explain some of this terminology that I'm going to use here in a minute, but some of the opposition came from Torah-observant Christians. And specifically what they opposed was Paul's proclamation of the gospel free from the works of the law. So we're going to see here there are really kind of two technicalities we need to account for. What does it mean to be a Torah-observant Christian, and what does it mean to preach a gospel free from the works of the law? And I'll get into that in a moment. But the other kind of opposition that Paul encountered was from Rome. Okay? Now, eventually, it really was from Rome itself, from the city of Rome, where he was martyred. But initially, it would have been from local authorities who were either representatives of Rome in a place like Philippi or Ephesus or somewhere like that, or it might have been representatives of Rome who were kind of client kings. And I'll explain that when we look at his adventures in Damascus. So he's getting opposition, from a couple of different quarters, but primarily it's from these Torah-observant Christians and from Rome itself. Now, let's talk about what it means to be a Torah-observant Christian. Traditionally, and frankly, this language of Judaizer comes from Galatians itself, from the letter of Galatians, where in a confrontation there at Antioch with Cephas, with Peter, he ends up saying, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile, how can you insist that these Gentiles be Judaized? Okay? And that's the word in Greek. Traditionally, therefore, people who would insist that Gentile converts be, as it were, Judaized, were called Judaizers. I don't like this language. I think it's probably polemical in its intent, but from an historical perspective today, it's a problematic word because it conflates ethnicity with religious commitments. Okay? Interestingly, even in Greek in the first century, it becomes a real problem when you read the Gospel of John. Judaioi is an ambiguous term. Judaioi is the Greek word for Jew. And it can be translated either Jew in the sense of somebody who believes in one God, etc., or it can mean someone who lives in Judea. Okay? Because there it's got a geographic term. And one of the tensions in John's Gospel particularly is the tension that arises from the fact that Jesus is from the north. He's from Galilee. And a lot of his opposition came from the south, in and around Jerusalem, which is, if you will, the capital of Judea. So frequently when the word judaioi comes up in the Gospel of John, the kind of a flat-footed translation would simply say, well, the Jews retorted to Jesus and said, you are born in iniquity, or something like that, when in fact it probably ought not be translated Jew, but rather Judean. Okay? As I said, and you find in all the Gospels, it's particularly acute in the fourth Gospel, is this tension between the fact that Jesus is from the north and he's opposing people there in the south, okay? Specifically where the temple is concerned. I'll have more to say about that in a minute, but you find similar issues then with this language of Judaizers. Are we talking about an ethnic group? Are we talking about a series of religious commitments? So today, and frankly this is my little contribution to understanding the place of Christianity within Judaism, I prefer to use the term Torah observant. Because there, Torah observance really refers to a kind of commitment to live by the laws and ordinances that are found in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now again, remember, Torah had then, has now, a very specific meaning. It's not law in general, or a kind of a conceptual understanding of God's law. It is rather 5 books. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The first 5 books of what today we call the Old Testament. But you go into any synagogue even today, and you say, we're going to read Torah. They say to you, we're going to read Torah. They're going to read a passage from either Genesis or Exodus or Leviticus or Numbers or Deuteronomy. It's very important we learn that. Torah is one of 3 important divisions of what we would today call the Hebrew Scriptures. There's Torah, there is Nevi'im, the prophets, which would be either those works that are ascribed to prophets, the book of the prophet Amos, the book of the prophet Isaiah, the book of the prophet Jeremiah, or those books that tell us the adventures of prophets. So 1 Samuel, because Nathan appears there. 1st and 2nd Kings, because Elijah and Elisha appear there. So, some of those things that we today would probably call historical books, the ancients would have called Nevi'im because it tells the stories of prophets. Okay? Then the 3rd category is Ketubim, which literally in Hebrew means that which is written. And one way to define the Ketubim is anything that's not Torah, anything that's not Nevi'im. Okay? Anything that's not the law, not the prophets, but the Ketubim, the writings, okay? That's what the Ketubim could be translated as also, includes some of the best known and most beloved passages from the Scriptures, like the Psalms, like the Proverbs, other instances of wisdom literature, Job, and so forth and so on. Okay? So we talk typically today, and even in Jesus' day, they would have talked about the law, the prophets, and the writings. You go to a synagogue today, they'll talk about Tanakh. And Tanakh is an acronym for Torah, that's the Ta part, Nevi'im, that's the N part, and Ketubim, that's the K part. Okay? So Tanakh. All right? That makes sense, everybody? Yeah.
Could you explain what the Mishnah and the Gemara is?
Those are works of rabbis written much later than the Scriptures themselves, probably between the 6th and the 10th centuries of the Common Era. Together, Mishnah and Gemara constitute Talmud. Okay? And so it's really a 2-volume work, right? Talmud is a 2-volume work. The first one is the Mishnah. The second one is the Gemara, okay, or the completion, as it's called. All right? And Rabbinic Judaism is really fascinating, but way beyond the scope of our efforts in talking about Paul. Okay? Now, so I like to use the language of Torah observant, right? And we'll talk about what that means here in a minute, but the other context that we need to consider is Judaism and Christianity and the kind of complicated relationship that began to form mostly after the death of Jesus. This is one of my favorite 20th century artists. Anybody know who did this? This is Marc Chagall, okay? You go to, next time you're in Chicago, go to the Art Institute, and there is this wonderful series of windows that Chagall designed, and it features Ezekiel and Jeremiah and so forth. This is actually a painting, and you'll see here, it's called simply Israel. And this is Moses, and you can always tell it's Moses because of the mistranslation of the Hebrew text, but it shows him having horns coming out of his head, and really the word means like rays of light. And who do you think this guy is right here? Huh? No! What's he got on his head?
Crown.
Crown.
David?
Probably more Solomon. Okay? Yeah, but still important. And there's the menorah in the background, and all this is just sort of, they're rejoicing, right? Okay? It's, you know, from Chagall's point of view, it's good to be a member of the chosen people. Okay? Now, Judaism, it's like Christianity in the sense that today, Christianity takes lots of forms and shapes, right? Okay? I mean, I think right along Forsyth itself, you have Catholic Student Center. What else is here? There's the Lutheran, yeah, down on the other side of Big Bend. And I think the Episcopalians have got something pretty close also, do they not?
Unity.
And what?
Unity Church.
Unity Church has got a campus ministry, okay? Now, frankly, you go to the Episcopal Church, and for that matter, the Lutheran campus ministry, and what would happen there would look a lot like what happens here, is my guess, even liturgically. Do the Greek Orthodox have a ministry to WashU students? I'm a little surprised, actually, because I would think there would be a fair amount of young Orthodox students here. What other campus ministries are there that surround the college? Y'all know? Of course, you come here. What do you care about these other places? But Hillel is down the street, but that's for Jew. I'm thinking about Christianity.
Presbyterian Church.
Presbyterian Church has got something going. Okay.
Harambe, which is like evangelical.
Harambe is evangelical. Okay. And here's the deal: you go to those places, and liturgically, they're going to look very different. The Catholics, the Lutherans, and the Episcopalians, it's all going to look pretty much the same. But the others, it's going to look very, very different. And yet they all call themselves Christian, right? And furthermore, when you can think about the styles of governance in these various churches, how the Episcopal Church governs itself is very different than the way in which the Catholic Church organizes itself, which is very different from Orthodoxy, which is very different from, name your denomination, right? And yet we all call ourselves Christian. Well, similarly in Judaism, there are a number of different groups. We can call them somewhat anachronistically denominations, right? And that way you know that they've got something that they would recognize in common, but they've also got a number of differences that distinguish them from one another. And we know what some of them are. The Pharisees, we are familiar with from the Gospels, as the Sadducees also make an appearance in the Gospels. The Zealots don't, but we know about them from Josephus, who's an historian of the first century. These are people that really resented the Roman occupation of the land and advocated really military resistance against them. The Essenes. We know about them because of a remarkable archaeological find out in the Judean desert, more or less between Jerusalem and the Dead Sea, that today we call Qumran. And it was this community. Initially, we thought it was a kind of a Jewish monastic community, and then when people began to, sort of explore the site more thoroughly, we found the graves of women and children. So it's very clear these were not Jewish monks, because that's how they were imagined, at least initially. But it was whole families. But it was sectarian and had withdrawn, so to speak, from mainstream life in Jerusalem and sort of set up a separate community. Again, not unlike, for instance, some Christian sects have done in the United States, like the Amish or the Mennonites or something like that. Literally sectarian. You withdraw from, interchange with a larger culture. The Therapeutai, we know mostly, again, from Josephus, they seem to be a group of people living primarily in the diaspora up there in, or over in Egypt, okay? Now, therapeutai, in Greek, anybody know what that word might mean? What does it look like in English?
Therapeutic.
Therapeutic, therefore, what do you think the therapeutai are all about? Yeah, healing in some fashion, but they believed in Yahweh, and yet they organized themselves almost, we think, as a kind of a therapeutic, literally a therapeutic community. Yeah.
Was John the Baptist an Essene?
There's lots of speculation about that because he's out in the desert and the Essenes are out in the desert and, all of that. The desert's a really big place though. Okay? Just because he's out there and they're out there doesn't necessarily mean they are, kindred spirits. The more we discover about the Essenes, the less likely it is that the baptizer was part of them. Okay? Now, one of the things, so we know about the differences. Pharisees, for instance, hoped in the resurrection of the dead. Okay? The Sadducees did not. And the Sadducees did not because they did not see any evidence that the hope of resurrection appears in Torah. And for Sadducees, some of this has to do with sort of what's the binding value of some of their sacred literature. For Sadducees, if something is found in Torah, you are obliged to believe it. But if it's found in prophets, it's up to you to decide whether you want to believe it or not. The Pharisees, on the other hand, believed in the hope of the resurrection and admitted it's only found in prophetic literature, but then insisted that prophetic literature is equally binding upon a believer, right? So you got kind of questions about what's the value of our sacred literature. The Pharisees believed in some respects, staying at a distance from Rome. The Sadducees advocated collaboration with them. The power, of the two groups here, the Pharisees and the Sadducees are the ones that we know best. The Pharisees had as their kind of organizational or institutional base the synagogue, okay? Whereas the Sadducees had as their institutional base the temple. Now today in contemporary Judaism, oftentimes temple and synagogue are used as interchangeable terms. That was not the case in the first century. You had one temple, it was the temple in Jerusalem. You had many synagogues, okay? There could be as many synagogues as there were villages. And in some cases, if the village is large enough, it might have 2 synagogues or even 3, okay? Some Christians thought of themselves as a kind of denomination of Judaism. Now, I think from one point of view, you can see why they might. Jesus was Jewish, Peter was Jewish, Mary was Jewish. I mean, everybody you know from the New Testament was born a Jew. Okay? Jesus was Torah observant even. So it kind of makes sense that they might consider themselves, if you will, a kind of reformed branch of Judaism. Because this hope of a Messiah, this hope of resurrection, all of that is found particularly in the prophetic literature. Interestingly, early Christians and early Pharisees had a great deal in common. The only difference between a Christian living in Judea and a Pharisee living in Judea is the Christian would have insisted, yes, and we have evidence of the hope of resurrection insofar as God has raised Jesus from the dead. Okay? And while we tend to think of the Pharisees as kind of antagonists where Jesus is concerned, that also may be a matter of tone in the Gospels. A lot of that kind of discussion between Jesus and Pharisees, which can seem pretty rough if you look at it in print, if you think about it as banter, particularly banter between guys, then you can see this could actually be less acrimonious than you might imagine. I'm going to finish my thought here, okay? But think about, especially you guys, think about the kind of banter you have with one another, particularly when you're trash talking at sports, right? Do we have any athletes here in the room? What's your sport?
Rugby.
Rugby. Do you trash talk your opponents?
A little bit.
I think we have a little understatement there. Are you an athlete? No? Okay. Troy's an athlete. You were at one point what was that Frisbee game called? Ultimate Frisbee, yeah. We actually, I think, when he was a grad student at Aquinas, didn't we fund you on something? Weren't you a member of our, like, Ultimate Frisbee team or something?
Because obviously Aquinas Institute did not have their own collegiate Ultimate Frisbee team, I petitioned the national organization to be able to play for St. Louis University's collegiate Ultimate Frisbee team.